Welcome to the 367th of the COVID calls. This is a daily discussion of the COVID-19 pandemic with a diverse collection of disaster experts. My name is Scott Gabriel Knowles. I'm a historian of disasters at the Korea Advanced Institute of Science and Technology. I'm coming to you live from Daejeon, South Korea. Today, I welcome writer and political analyst Nanjala Nyabolala to COVID Calls. She's the author of Traveling While Black, Essays Inspired by a Life on the Move. Just a reminder, you can usually catch COVID calls live on weekdays at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. Just go to the COVID Calls YouTube channel to watch. Today is a special COVID calls at 7 p.m. Korea time. You can hear COVID calls anytime, recorded as podcasts on Spotify, iTunes, Podbean, or anywhere you get podcasts. You can also keep up with COVID calls via Twitter using the handle at US of Disaster or at COVID calls. Please help spread the word and send suggestions for future guests and future topics. And please feel free to suggest yourself as a future guest. As of today, October 29th, 2021, there are 4,982,198 deaths from COVID 19 globally. That's according to the Johns Hopkins University Coronavirus Resource Center. The nation of Kenya reports 5,270 deaths from COVID 19. I've been reading an obituary or a story of advocacy for those impacted by the pandemic. I'd like to continue that reading now. The headline is Illinois family pleads with vaccine skeptics after fully vaxxed grandmother dies at 66. Our worst fears came true. It was written by Manny Ramos and appeared in the Chicago Sun-Times. Springfield family is pleading for vaccine skeptics to get the jab after their beloved matriarch, who was vaccinated but immunocompromised, died of COVID 19 last month. We did everything we were supposed to, Mark Ayers said. We listened to the experts, socially distanced ourselves, wore masks, got vaccinated, and we are left dealing with the loss of our mother because others refused to do the same. Mark Ayers' mother, 66-year-old Candace Ayers, died at HSHS St. John's Hospital in Springfield after a month-long fight with COVID 19. The grandmother, who loved spending time with her daughter's triplets, is believed to have caught the disease while visiting a family friend in Mississippi. She's one of more than nearly 600 fully vaccinated people in Illinois to die of COVID this year, including 278 in September. About 53% of those, like Ayers, had an underlying health condition or were immunocompromised, while 87% are over 65, state data shows. Mark Ayers said he was worried when his parents wanted to visit the wife of a friend who died of a heart issue that was exacerbated by COVID 19. More breakthrough COVID infections means more people could be mildly infected and not know it. We were very nervous about sending her because it was Mississippi, but my mother's doctor cleared her to travel, saying as long as she was vaccinated, there isn't a concern. He said, we should have gotten a second opinion. The concern for his mother wasn't just because of her age, but because of her rheumatoid arthritis and autoimmune disease. In mid July, Mississippi was at the beginning of a surge of positive COVID 19 cases, with the arrival of the Delta variant reaching a higher number of daily cases than it had for the entire pandemic thus far. This was also happening as Mississippi's Republican Governor Tate Reeves called federal recommendations for people to wear masks indoors, quote, foolish and quote unquote harmful. My parents were only in Mississippi for 4 days, and on the car ride back, my mother was already having full blown COVID symptoms, Mark Ayers said. When they got home, Ayers and his sister didn't think it could be COVID 19. After all, they were vaccinated. But as the days went on, her symptoms got worse, Mark Ayers said. On July 28th, our worst fears came true, and she tested positive, and she wasn't getting any better. She was taken to the nearest hospital in Springfield, where she was given some antibiotics and sent home. In early August, she was taken back to the emergency room where she was finally admitted. Her condition would only worsen over the next 3 weeks. She was placed on an oxygen mask, had a blood transfusion, and was eventually put on a ventilator. It all was just too much for her body to handle, Mark Ayers said. We made the decision to put her in comfort care and wanted to let her go as peacefully as possible. She died in early September. Family was devastated and angry. They wanted to call out those who politicized the pandemic and were refusing to take it seriously. So Amanda Ayers, Mark Ayers' sister, and Candace Ayers' daughter penned an obituary that was published in the State Journal Register. Quoting from this here, from the obituary here, she was preceded in death by more than 4,531,799 others infected with COVID, the obituary read. She was vaccinated but was infected by others who chose not to be. The cost was her life. The goal was to send a message to not only the people they knew, but to the entire country, Mark Ayers said. We wanted to send this message home that it is the unvaccinated and the unmasked in this country that are largely responsible for where we are today, not just with our family, but as a country, he said. The CDC has said the Delta variant is twice as contagious as previous variants of COVID 19, and unvaccinated people are at the greatest risk of transmission. However, even fully vaccinated, immunocompromised people are particularly vulnerable to breakthrough cases. Limiting their exposure to COVID is why public health officials push wide scale inoculations for the entire population. That herd immunity would also help protect others who make up the small percentage of people that vaccines don't work for. We're seeing a segment of the population not only refusing to be vaccinated, but making this a political issue, or at worst, calling it a hoax that's only downplaying the significance of this disease, Mark Ayers said. Then, when the FDA approved a vaccine, people are refusing to take it because of political reasons, thinking this pandemic is a joke. More importantly, he said, he wants immunocompromised people and their families to take extreme caution when they're thinking about venturing outside their bubbles. I wish someone had expressed that caution for us, and it's a mistake we have to live with for the rest of our lives with not having a mother, he said. The headline was Illinois family pleads with vaccine skeptics after fully vaxxed grandmother dies at 66. Our worst fears came true, by Manny Ramos in the Chicago Sun-Times. Okay, I'd like to turn to my conversation for today, one I've really been looking forward to, and let me introduce my guest, Nanjala Nyabala. Nanjala Nyabala is a writer and researcher based in Nairobi, Kenya. Her work focuses on the intersection between technology, media, and society. In addition to academic writing, she writes analysis and commentary for numerous publications around the world and is the author of Digital Democracy, Analog Politics, How the Internet Era is Transforming Politics in Kenya, which appeared with Zed Books in 2018, and Traveling While Black, Essays Inspired by a Life on the Move, which appeared just last year in 2020 with Hearst Books. Nanjala Nyabala, thank you so much for joining me on COVID Calls today.
Thank you for having me.
I'd like to start the way I generally do, just find out where you're calling from and what the pandemic's looking like.
I'm in Nairobi. The weather is finally turning, so it's getting a little bit warmer, which is good. The COVID situation official is in Nairobi. You have to, I guess, make a distinction between the official statistics and what the general feeling is in the community. Officially, we've turned a corner after the third wave. I think the worst case positivity rate we had between March and July was 17% or just under 18%. So it was really dire for a couple of weeks. It seemed like we were about to hit the big one, the big wave that everybody had been holding their breath against. And then right now, I think it's less than 2%. So that's the official numbers. And that's part of the reason why some of the measures that were taken to slow down the pandemic have been lifted. So the curfew was lifted last week. And well, to be honest, that's probably the only thing that was left. A lot of the things had been sort of falling away as the economic pressure, the political pressure kind of grew. So the feeling is that the pandemic has, the wave has passed. There's a lot more people getting vaccinated. There's a lot more people who are aware of the disease and who are responding to the public health measures. And people are generally more conscious of COVID today than they were this time last year. And so I would say that it does feel like we've turned a corner with the wave. It does, but the hospitals are still full, and there's still a number of cases that we're getting every day. So yeah.
And Have you been in lockdown at once or multiple junctures throughout the pandemic?
Multiple junctures. The curfew has been pretty much consistent since March of 2020. I think there was only a brief window of time when we didn't have a curfew of about 4 or 5 weeks. So pretty much since March 2020, we've been under some kind of curfew. The worst lockdown was between April 2020 and July 2020, when there was an almost complete, the language that they use here is cessation of movement. So no public transit circulating, or limited public transit circulating, no traveling in between counties. We have 47 counties, so we weren't allowed to move between the counties. And closure of churches, closure of mosques, all of the sites of gathering, and schools. Schools were closed for most of of last year. So the worst of it was in April through July of last year. Since then, it's kind of been the measures getting less and less strict over time, but there being some kind of baseline, which was the curfew, was that between 10 p.m. and 5 a.m. all over the country, there not being any, you're not allowed to be circulating, basically. And then we have also had regional lockdowns. So the pandemic has been very regionalized in Kenya, in that it's been very urban, peri-urban. So all of the major towns have had at some point some kind of restriction of movement, restriction on gathering. Nairobi, every cycle, obviously, because Nairobi has been the hardest hit.
And has the government provided some measure of financial support for those who've been in lockdown and unable to work?
No,
Hmm.
it's part of the reason why there's so much pressure for things to reopen. So there was at the very beginning some efforts with the especially with foreign donors in informal settlements to keep people at home. There
Hmm.
was some measure where some governments were doing, we have the mobile money, the money that, it's very easy to centralize, to distribute money to people's phone numbers. So in the very first lockdown, there was some ad hoc measures with various donors to give money to people in informal settlements only, because the anxiety was that because of the housing conditions, this is where the pandemic, if it's going to break out, this is where it's going to be really bad. People living in close quarters, poor ventilation, and not really having any access to routine healthcare the way that you would want it to be. So in the beginning, there was some of that. It was not systemic, it was not widespread, and it was not sustainable, because the government was depending on other people to provide the funding for that, because the Kenya government's broke. Um, since then, I know, and that's, people at some point stopped really staying home. Like, the only measures that people have somewhat stuck to has been the curfew, and even that, it has been very classed. So, wealthier people have been circumventing the curfew for the longest time. Nightclubs locking people in so that people, don't go home during the curfew times. They go home at 6 in the morning. And poor people have borne the brunt of the policing measures, arbitrary arrests and detention, killings. I mean, that's been the policing of the curfew has been very classed. So that's the discrepancy, that the measures have been there. Adherence has been steadily dwindling broadly. But I would say even and that big reason for that is the economic anxiety. A lot of people just can't stay home. If you're a day laborer and you're
Sure.
dependent on that $1.50 a day, you're not going to be able to stay home indefinitely. So,
And what about for you? I wonder if you wouldn't mind sharing a memory or something that really resonates for you personally about this time.
um, I'm incredibly privileged because I've been working from home since 2017. The big hit for me has been the inability to travel. So I didn't travel for about a year and a bit. Um, and I feel like it wasn't a huge adjustment for me to work from home. And when you're an introvert and people say all the parties are canceled, you're like, yay. I think the big thing that really sticks out is because of the way Nairobi is, the zoning laws are very poorly enforced. And so you would have like bars and clubs. I have a bar near where I live, and hearing the inequality is going to be the enduring memory for me. because you will read the news about a poor young man or woman who was coming home from work, and just got caught up in traffic and didn't make it home on time and ended up in jail or ended up dead. We had two young university students who were shot down by the police. And reading that news while hearing a nightclub with luxury cars parked out front, and knowing that those people are going to be locked up in that club overnight, breaking every rules, watching the politicians having their rallies, gathering thousands and thousands of people while killing people, for, having a birthday, arresting people for having a birthday party, for going to a birthday. Like, the enduring experience for me in Nairobi is going to be this recollection of how brazen the inequality in this town has become, and how it has become ingrained in the way that we think about illness and disease and responding to it. Because all of the rumors about this being a great equalizer have come to naught. It's completely unfounded. If anything, it's just made the inequality much more stark, and that's going to be my enduring memory of this period.
Well, you've been vocal on this issue. I just want to read a couple of sentences from an article that you published in August in the New Internationalist. And the context of that time wasn't that long ago, but it was a period of a rising wave. And in this piece, you're talking about the concern that Kenya might go the way of India, which was really suffering at that time. I'm going to read a couple of sentences. This is really strong. Individual and community level action, you write, has saved Kenya from a far worse outbreak than we've witnessed to date, as communities accepted that the government wasn't coming to help them and found ways to provide for each other and themselves. But this isn't a public health strategy, you write. Citizens acting in the absence of government cannot outrun the consequences of a government acting in contradiction to the interests of the people. Just want to see if that's a couple months back, looking back on those words. Anything different or better, or it still seems kind of the same, people having to sort of ad hoc their way out of this through community resilience?
Absolutely. I mean, the real superstars in Kenya have been the community health workers, and operating, going door to door. And this is something that the head of the Africa CDC observed very early on, when there was this sort of unjustified wave of anxiety about, will Africans be able to get vaccinated? And it's like, we've been doing door-to-door vaccinations since as time immemorial. I've had all of my vaccinations from a community health, except for, the newborn ones. But like my polio vaccine, the vaccinator came to the house. Measles, they come to the house, and they go to the most remote villages in this country. So when the Kenyan government wants you to get vaccinated, you will get vaccinated. So the community health workers have been the superstars in this period, that they have been doing awareness without a lot of funding, without a lot of support, doing door to door, doing radio. That's been the thing that's stopped us from spiraling, I think, because we certainly haven't treated our doctors very well. We certainly haven't treated our nurses very well. As we speak, the government is in the middle of a campaign to sell, for lack of a better word, nurses to the United Kingdom. They entered a special deal where the UK would hire, nurses from Kenya, as if we have the spare capacity, as if we can afford to lose 1,000, 2,000 nurses, because the UK has lost so many because of the pandemic. So it's been, the community health workers have been that buffer, and people organizing, supporting each other. Social scientists call Kenya a dual system. So, and I write a little bit about this in Digital Democracy, that because of the way the colonial structure was put in place, most of us have one foot in an urban context and one foot in a rural context. That's another phenomenon that's really been a buffer, so that a lot of people have a place that they could go where they're not paying rent, and they're not they're living on a slightly less cash intensive context. So the mass exodus that happened during the first, second lockdown, a lot of people didn't come back to the urban context because, you can work the land. It's less, there's less, there's less amenities and things like that, but you are not paying rent. You are, not, the overheads are slightly less intensive. And so that dual system has also been a buffer, I think, economically, that a lot of people had somewhere else that they could go, and not become homeless and all of that. People sending money, remittances, international remittances, sending money to relatives. I mean, that's something that I think everybody, myself included, we've had to do during this pandemic, is to keep someone in another part of the country solvent. And so these are the dynamics that I think have buffered people, and that sense of community, where you don't have the expectation that the government is going to show up, because they haven't shown up in so many different contexts, and having this self-help drive and this self-help sort of it's ingrained in the society. But as I said in that article, it's not sustainable. This is not a community level threat. This is an international level threat. Basics of political theory. We leave the state of nature and we enter the state of man so that we can be provided for by our governments. And to have this disproportionate taking of our rights, our freedom of our freedom of association, our freedom, of circulation, freedom of movement, and not have a concomitant investment in making public health work, I think is a gross violation of the very basic principles of government and governance. And I think that frustration endures, that frustration of, why am I looking out for myself when I pay taxes, when I, have given up all of these freedoms in order to live in an organized society?
I was talking about this tension just the other day with a psychologist in Ireland, Orla Muldoon, and we're talking about this tension between community level solidarity and what you're describing, and resourcefulness, and this dual system where people they have to move um, at some point, but they can find ways to be resourceful, at least for a period of time. Um, and and so we want to celebrate that. I mean, I think anywhere in the world where we find people in solidarity, we're like, great. But on the other hand, it just as you're saying, it's like, that's not public health in the way that it needs to function, particularly in an epidemic or a pandemic. So we find ourselves kind of at cross purposes, because you want to celebrate that resourcefulness, but at the same time, as you say, it's not ultimately sustainable. Is that, I mean, is that a longstanding tension in Kenya? Maybe help me understand a little bit kind of the inheritance of this problem in Kenya.
It is, and in my assessment, our national motto in the country is Harambe, and Harambe, it's got a contentious history, but the translation that we are offered is "Let us pull together," and from independence 1963, there was this ethos of community action being the driving force of the Kenyan political identity, that people would come together at a local level and address local level problems. And so Harambe also has its roots in African socialism, which is Kenya's official ideology. And the way Kenyatta the first interpreted African socialism was that it was capitalist with socialist characteristics. So how that has played out historically is that there is capitalist in accumulation, in monetization of everything, and all of that stuff, and socialist in abandoning responsibility, abdicating responsibility, the central state abdicating its responsibilities. And so in practical terms, I think it really, the stark the division sort of between these two, or the contradiction, really starts to take root in the 1990s, at the end of the Cold War, the end of, Kenya sided with the West. And at the end of the Cold War, you had this massive contraction in foreign aid, the end of the one-party state, the end of the dependency economy, and the services start to collapse everywhere. Suddenly, you can't drink the tap water. The public schools are falling apart. The public universities are falling apart. you can't, the largesse of this one party regime cannot be sustained after the end of the Cold War. And structural adjustment obviously as well, you know, these large cuts to public spending in the country. The first victim is always health, education. Nobody ever says, let's cut the military budget. Let's spend less on guns. It's always health, it's always education, it's always the things that people actually use. And so in that contraction, self-help becomes a much more urgent ethos, that in order to go to university, people have, we call them harambes, you know, people have to put money together to send kids to university. When someone gets sick, the hospital bill is too high. We have a harambe, we pay for this person to get healthcare. Whenever there's a thing that needs a systemic response, instead, people opt for self-help because of that, experiencing that contraction. And I think right now it's really embedded in the way the society functions, that the expectations of the government are so low, even though the taxes remain incredibly high, and you know, the need remains, but the expectations are so low. People aren't attuned to, you know, maybe we need to have a much more coordinated response to this. Right now in Nairobi, I mean, and I would say that I'm not an outlier. This happens everywhere. Private water supply, private security guards, private generators for electricity. If you are middle class and above, this is the reality. You buy water every week. And yet, the taxes still come. You still have to pay the National Health Insurance Fund a percentage of your earnings. You still have to pay, you know, the county council for water collection, for garbage collection. So there's this weird space, this duality that makes these kinds of developments possible. That the National Health Insurance Fund, which is a mandatory fund that takes, I think it's like 2% out of everybody's salary, will say, we are not going to cover COVID hospitalization unilaterally, and there be no public pushback against that. Well, we'll just have a harambe. Many people who have had people in hospital, the COVID bills are coming to about $20,000 for people who survive. If you get intubated, you know, and you happen to survive, I think the survival rate for intubation is like 10%.
Right.
$20,000 in a country where the minimum wage is $50 a month. So people have been paying for that through collective action. It's not sustainable. It's not sustainable. And the burden, the tension, you know, it plays out. People opting out of society, I think, has a much more significant impact than just the material conditions that we live in. There's also a psychological impact that it has on our sense of community and our sense of belonging and our sense of statehood. And this is what I think makes, one of the things that I think makes Kenyan statehood so fragile. Everybody's looking out for themselves, even while the burden of extraction from the government remains omnipresent. So this is the reality that we're living in right now, that the pandemic just kind of exacerbates this history of, you know, I don't like it, but I'm going to keep paying the government even though I know that they're not going to show up. I'm not happy about it, but I'm going to keep playing along because that's what my parents did. That's what my grandparents did.
Just a reminder, you're listening to COVID Calls, and I'm talking to Nanjala Nyabala today about COVID and Kenya. And I want to, Nanjala, come to discussion of your book, Digital Democracy, Analog Politics, How the Internet Era is Transforming Politics in Kenya. It came out in 2018. And everybody should grab this book. And it's gotten tremendous reviews. I wonder how you view that book now, sort of refracted back through the lens of COVID. I mean, it's a book that sort of explores social media use in Kenya and the ways that politics are transformed through social media. You know, digital divide issues, I think, are on the table as well. And now we've had this sort of big national crisis, just as you were explaining, not necessarily a new crisis, a continuation of an older crisis, maybe in some ways. How do you see that work now?
That's a fantastic question. It's the same in the sense that there's so much good that happened and there's so much bad that happened. And it's one of the difficulties in talking about technology and politics is that everybody is so absolute in their position that it must either be wholly negative or wholly positive. And the reality of Kenya, I think, the experience of Kenya, I think, shows up the reality that it's actually always going to be complicated. It's always going to be half and half or two-thirds and a third. It's always going to be a bit of both. So with regards to COVID, for example, one of the things I talk about in the book is about the uptake of social media and how the various platforms have become incredibly important to building new ways of being and belonging, building new ways of community. At the very beginning of the pandemic, obviously the overarching concern was misinformation, because misinformation has been such a huge problem in the West and has been such a huge obstacle to addressing the pandemic, even in the face of so much plenty with regards to vaccines. One of the first things that people did, and they did this entirely voluntarily, entirely decentralized, was translating WHO official information into languages other than English. So Kenya, officially bilingual English Kiswahili, but also 42 other languages spoken, not to mention many dialects of these languages. And people would take the WHO information and voluntarily produce graphics, distribute them on WhatsApp to make sure that the information on how to protect yourself from COVID was widely available for free to anybody who wanted it. I would say that the initial misinformation window in Kenya was tiny because of a lot of this action that people took, realizing that it might be a problem. You know, there was a wave right at the beginning. There was people with the high HCQ and the drinking bleach and all of that, because we do get a lot of that secondary blowback, and we do have people within the community who are interested in spreading misinformation. So that very quick response, acting before the problem arose, has really slowed down the spread of misinformation in this country. And that is the product of some of the energies and some of the cultural energies that I identify in the book. So in that regard, that's one thing that I would point out. Um, the other thing that I would point out is accountability. And again, I discussed this in the book, that when the curfews started, and there was this very harsh policing of the curfews in informal settlements in poorer communities, people used social media to raise awareness, even while the traditional media was reluctant to cover a lot of these stories. So, for example, there was a day where the government announced the curfew and gave people 3 hours to get back to the city. A regional lockdown in Nairobi gave people 3 hours to get back to the city, which of course caused a traffic jam of epic proportions. They put a barricade across the main highway and they wouldn't let anybody in or out, with the idea being that people would spend the night on the road and that would be a deterrence. Recording this, putting it on social media, creating this furor about this particular out. This is the reason why they stopped doing that. That telling a story that traditional media wouldn't touch, alerting people to the dangers that were playing out that were then going to be massaged or misrepresented on traditional media, causing this is part of the reason why this policy changed. And this is, again, one of the phenomena I talk about in the book, using social media to demand accountability. But we've also seen the negatives, and we've also seen, crackdowns on people who are seen to be antagonistic to whatever the government's trying to accomplish. When a corruption scandal is exposed and people are named, fear of intimidation by bloggers, by people who use social media. And like I said, the secondary effects of misinformation in the West, that a lot of the misinformation networks, I read a study in the New York Times that said the number one driver of misinformation in the United States was Donald Trump. And a lot of those stories find their way onto Kenyan bloggers and even the traditional media, and there's a knock-on effect on that. When there was a run on HCQ, on hydrochloroquine, the shortage, this was in Kenya, this was in Uganda, meant that lupus sufferers couldn't access this medicine that they need to stay alive. There's a knock-on effect to that misinformation. So I think that the book holds up really well. I mean, it has only been 3 years, but I think the book holds up really well. And I hope that people read it not as, here's this weird thing that's happening on the other side of the world, but as, here is an example of how information rooted in specific historical, cultural, political contexts behaves. And this is how we should, what the things that we should be paying attention to as we think about managing information in the digital age. I think the COVID pandemic has reinforced a lot of the lessons and the ideas that I put out in the book. And for me personally, it's just been like um, reaffirming, of the arguments and the theories and the ideas that came from it.
Well, and you said, it's a recent book, and so it should hold up. And yet, a lot of times, disaster and war, it will change the way that even quite recent social science looks. But what you're describing is an extension of the work, not in any way a
Mhm.
refutation of it. I think your publisher is going to need to bring it back out in another edition with an epilogue. And I wanted to just ask one follow up. Is maybe you could tell me like how powerful state media is there, because I mean what we're seeing in the United States is now, and this is not really happening yet well, it's happening to a lesser extent in South Korea, but in the United States, major, mainstream news organizations now are fully enmeshed with social media. And so social
Yeah.
media, I wouldn't go so far as to say it completely drives the news cycle, but when Donald Trump had a Twitter
Mhm.
feed, it absolutely drove the news cycle.
Mhm.
And that was a big time in the pandemic. And so this idea that we can say, well, social media is sort of reaching this population and traditional legacy media is reaching this population. I'm not sure those boundaries hold up so well anymore. And I wonder how you assess that porosity there in Kenya.
Sure. I will say one thing. One of the most problematic developments in the United States news landscape has been the commercialization of news. That information is way more of a commodity in the United States than it is in many other jurisdictions. And the thing that makes the biggest difference, I would say, is the presence of a well funded, well supported public broadcaster, which the United States doesn't have, right?
Right.
NPR,
Right.
PBS all depend on donors. It's for all of its problems, for all of its issues, and the BBC, especially under the Johnson administration, has had a lot of issues. The presence of the BBC, the presence of Deutsche Welle in Germany, the presence of all of these well-funded public broadcasters is important, and it's a public service that's important to addressing this not even bifurcation, it's like atomization of news media. The difference between a person who gets their information on social media and a person who gets their information from buying a newspaper is that a person who is reading social media is reading curated information. So they're not getting the 360. Might get a deep dive into like 30% of what's happened in the world today, but they're not getting a 360 of how all these things connect to each other. And that's what a big broadcaster is supposed to do. Is supposed to give you not just the information, but the context in which the information is produced. So we're in a very strange place in Kenya in that we do have a public broadcaster. Um, the public broadcaster is the only, no, it has the second widest coverage. There's a private broadcaster that has recently superseded them. But 78% coverage of the national territory is astounding, right? We've had the atomization of radio. Most Kenyans get their information from the radio. We have 116 radio stations.
Wow.
And that's not even like community radio. That's just the ones that are private licenses. We have about 30 television stations. I have to double check that number. But only 2 of these broadcasters have anything that comes close to national coverage, and that is the national broadcaster, KBC, and the Citizen Media, which is a private broadcaster. Um, so it's kind of like an in-between thing in that um, there are still few enough Kenyans relative to the size of the population who are online. And there's still enough geographical concentration around specific places, Nairobi, Mombasa, Kisumu, Nakuru, that there isn't this overwhelming dependence on social media the way that you see in the United States. It doesn't yet drive the news agenda the way it does in the US. However, it does have a significant impact. I call the network effect and the amplification effect.
Mm-hmm.
The network effect in that the in urban contexts especially, you do see that. You see television stations relying on what's trending online to give them content, to give them something to talk about. So you do see that symbiosis between those two things. And then the other thing is, once they do that, then amplifying it and putting it, in front of people who are not on social media, who don't have Facebook, who don't have Twitter, who are not on WhatsApp and whatever. The thing that's going to make the biggest change, I think, in the next 5 years is WhatsApp, because WhatsApp is now bundled free whenever you buy a smartphone in the country.
I see. Mm-hmm.
And that's going to be an issue moving forward, because more and more people are going to be dependent on their networks, and there's increasing attention being paid to this. Why do you believe something that's sent to you by someone that you trust? That's how information travels in WhatsApp. It's people that you have in your contact list. It's not like, there's I don't know if you saw this Pew study. I put it in Digital Democracy, that most people who are on Twitter are talking to people they don't know. And that has a moderating effect on belief, on their people are almost primed to be a little bit more skeptical, because I don't know this person. It's not 100% guarantee, but it's there. Whereas WhatsApp, it's people who are in your contact list.
Right.
So you're primed for belief, and you're primed to go along with whatever they put in your inbox. And it's that discrepancy, as WhatsApp becomes more popular, that I think is going to be worth paying attention to. How is this going to affect how, and how is it going to affect how we receive and process information? And will we see the same amplification network effect with traditional media, given that you can't measure virality on WhatsApp? You can't measure how far the information has traveled on WhatsApp.
Right.
So yeah, I think those are the things that we should be paying attention to.
Talking to NANJALA NYABOLA today on COVID Calls, I want to come to discussion of your most recent book, Traveling While Black: Essays Inspired by a Life on the Move, and came out in the pandemic. You're one of the authors I've talked to who's had a book come out and trying to figure out how do you promote a book while you're there
Don't recommend it.
in your apartment. You're not the first to tell me that. I just want to say, I mean, this is a magnificent book, and to me, I mean, I love reading travel writing. I love traveling, but I mean, this is also like this book. Travel is like I think it's a form of consciousness for you. I mean, that's how I read it, and not only for you, but also consciousness raising for readers like myself. But I want to start with what for me was an important part of reading this book, in which you explain travel guides.
Yeah.
And I'm reading this, and I'm thinking, how many Lonely Planet guides do I have on my bookshelf? And why do those books? Yeah, I know, and you'll explain it, of course, beautifully. But I thought, these books always made so much sense to me. They were reaching me at a level that was deeper than like, here's what to go see when you go to Rome, right? But I don't think I ever fully understood that, because I'd never asked the hard questions about those books, and you did.
Yeah. I mean, like I have like 20. You can't see them; they're all the way up there. But I started to ask questions when I started to travel more regularly in Africa. Just like most people, when we grew up with a yearning for travel, there's the quintessential places that are romanticized in fiction and in history. I gotta go to Paris. I have to go to New York. I have to go to London. There's like, when you consume popular culture and you decide that that's an entry point of how you're going to think about travel, there are places that sort of populate your list. So started to do that, and said, I'm not having the same experience, but okay, it's probably just me. I'm probably just being weird. But when I started traveling in Africa is when the questions really start to coalesce, because it just becomes really obvious that there are things that I'm seeing, that I'm feeling, that I'm being made to feel, that the book is skipping over or ignoring altogether. And in so doing, kind of giving us a very narrow experience, and exposing people to some kinds of risks, and at the same time being very cruel to a lot of places in the world. So, the opening paragraph in The Lonely Planet for Nairobi, and I'm not a person who romanticizes Nairobi at all. I know that this is a challenging town. However, it's a big town, and big towns are challenging places. There's a lot of wonderful stuff that happens in Nairobi. And The Lonely Planet basically says, don't don't plan to spend any time there. Get in and out as quickly as you can. You're probably going to get robbed. Like, I'm paraphrasing, but that's the gist of it. And I remember reading that and thinking, really, you found something nice to say about New York and all its rats, and Paris and its crowds, and the trash, Naples, but you couldn't find anything nice to say about a city of 5 million people that is a capital city, that is a cultural hub, that is, significant, and it's a place that people call home. And those are the kind of discrepancies that started to gnaw at me, because it was like, well, what would a person have experienced in order to have this viewpoint of travel guides? It's a very gendered and very racialized genre of writing, and we have more, and it's not necessarily because there hasn't been a history of people writing. There was a recent uh, viral thread about, I mean, viral amongst history nerds. It's not going to be viral against everybody, but
Mm.
about Moroccan Berber. He was officially a guide to a French explorer in the 17th century, but actually wrote his own travel recollections, and as they moved through the Maghreb. And so it's not that it's new that we've been writing, that people have been writing travel memories. It's that the industry, the the way in which the power brokers and the gatekeepers interpret travel writing is this Hemingway,
Right, right.
explorer. Let's go out and see what the savages are up to. Um, and for me, that has never been the point of travel. I think discovery as a paradigm can be a very it can lock in power dynamics that are unjust to the communities that are experienced, and um, when communicated to other audiences, I think it can be constraining. You're not an explorer. You're not going to go off and discover, Indiana Jones Temple of Doom things because you were in Nairobi for 2 days. But you might go to a nice art gallery, and you might have a nice walk, and it's that framing that I wanted people to really sit with the discomfort of what this explorer mentality is doing to the way people expect to experience the world, particularly when they travel in places like Nairobi, like Johannesburg, like Sao Paulo.
It's particularly poignant now. I mean, and throughout the pandemic, as people who have been able to try to move around have faced various restrictions. And even in the earlier part of the pandemic, when there was a sort of a culture of elite escape, and this has a very old
Mhm.
history. Um,
Mhm.
and so it even sort of double and triply reinforces some of the observations that you're making there. But I mean, you write not only about travel as exploration, but you also talk about the movement of people
Yeah,
and borders.
yeah.
And I'm just going to read just one little section here. You actually talk about your own experience of visas, and you say visas are a cruel and unusual invention. They are what a great line. They're a reminder of the human's near infinite capacity to invent things out of thin air and then reorder their lives completely around it, including their measure of the value of human life. And I mean, that's one chapter when you talk about your own experience of facing basically racism and trying to get a visa. But um, you talk about the sort of the emergence, of the encampment and the sort
Mm.
of global disaster now of migration, which has turned from migration to asylum to encampment. I mean,
Yeah.
so all of that again sort of filtered through COVID.
Yeah.
Just an
Yeah.
important set of observations. So maybe you can expand a little bit on that visa issue you
You,
had.
you know what's really interesting is at the very beginning of the pandemic, I actually wrote the last draft of the book while I was in Italy, and I left Italy like a week before their first COVID cases. Um, and I've kind of had this 1 month period in February where I was like one step ahead of the pandemic. So I left Italy and I went to DC, and then sort of like, and that feeling of the borders closing, because when I left Italy I couldn't go back, and when I left the United States there was a border closure, I couldn't go back, and then went to South Africa, and they had their first case like a day before I got there. When I left South Africa, couldn't go back, and then was on lockdown until this year. Um, a lot of people don't know, and this is to speak to the issue, is European countries, North American countries have not been issuing tourist visas since last year. They stopped allowing, at first it was only citizens who were allowed to go back, and then it was only people who were traveling for work reasons and long-term reasons. So like the US Embassy in Nairobi is only doing student visas, migration visas, green cards, and things like that. And I've had two Americans with Kenyan partners sort of reach out to me and be like, hey, uh, is this typical? Because I want my partner to come over for Thanksgiving. Is it typical that it's going to take 6 months for to get an appointment? I was like, no, 6 months isn't typical, but 3 months, yeah. If you're looking for a visa, 3 months is a normal wait time. And I was like, what? You wait 3 months to get a visa? And I was like, yeah, that's been the case since a time immemorial. We don't just walk into the embassy and say, hey, give me visa. There's like a 6 month process to it. And I think this experience of the lockdown has brought so many of these things to the attention of people who
Right.
otherwise took it for granted. Europeans,
Right.
especially, because Europeans have been banned from the US for the last year and a bit. And I get a lot of this from European people. It's like, I didn't realize that this was a thing that governments did. And I said, well, yeah. I can't just walk into an embassy in Europe, even if I have all of my documentation, they might still say no. And they do say no for arbitrary reasons. Um, so, in some ways, I think there's a slightly keener awareness that travel rules can be incredibly arbitrary, that your nationality is not a guarantee of anything. I was listening to the news the other day as well that the Russian government banned the US embassy from hiring Russians at the US embassy in Moscow. And so, what the US government did in response is that they stopped issuing visas in Moscow. And now, if you want to get a US visa, you have to travel to Krakow, you have to go to Poland. And so, there's this big diplomatic brouhaha that's been brewing between the US and Russia that you have to go to another country to apply for a visa. And I was like, that's been the case. If you are from Burundi, Burundi has an embassy, but if you are from Burundi and you want a Canadian passport, a visa, you have to come to Kenya. If you are from Benin and you want a British passport, you have to go to Nigeria. This is how we live. And so this is something that's been, I mean, like, I'm not going to lie to you, there's a bit of schadenfreude in that, like,
Sure.
yeah. But it's also, to make it bigger, why I've been paying attention to this whole vaccine passport thing.
Right.
I am not against the idea of verification of vaccination credentials. Absolutely. I have a yellow fever certificate. You have to show it every time you enter and leave certain countries. Measles, MMR, you have to show it when you enter and leave places where the disease is a problem. What I'm against is that people are not thinking critically about what it means to make this the norm when most of the world still does not have access to vaccines, and that there's a systematic effort to make sure that that access is not achieved in the fastest and most humane way. This is how the visa thing plays out. Because when the UK announced 2 weeks ago that you had to be fully vaccinated to enter the UK. So if it's a one dose vaccine, Johnson Johnson, fine. if it's the 2 dose that you've received 2 doses. The fine print in that was they were only accepting 4 out of the 7 vaccines that have been approved by the WHO.
Right.
They were for the India vaccine, Covishield vaccine, I think it's Covishield, the AstraZeneca vaccine, as produced in the United Kingdom, is identical to the AstraZeneca vaccine as produced in India. But they were not recognizing the vaccine that's produced in India as a valid vaccine, which meant, and that is the vaccine that is available in most of the rest of the world. Canada did the same thing. The EU did the same thing. Like, it's, for me, it just goes back to this thing that I was writing about, how we have this infinite capacity to come up with rules that reflect our own biases and predilections, and that are not rooted in creating a more just world, but in upholding inequality and exclusion. And so I was like, nobody's asking what's the most just way that we can put in place this policy so that it upholds the public health imperative, but doesn't normalize inequality. We are in a moment where the momentum is for exclusion, and especially exclusion of non-white populations. For me, there's a line that connects what we saw in the Haitians being rounded up on the Mexico border, the cages on the Mexico border, the boat returns in the South Pacific, the Rohingya encampment, the Somali encampment in Kenya, the deaths in the Mediterranean Sea. There's a line that unites those things, this growing anxiety around the other, and the Black other, the brown other. And that discourse being omnipresent in the context of a pandemic, what will migration policy look like? Every time it pops up, it seems to conform to that logic. And that's what I want people to pay attention to. I've been paying attention to migration. That's what that chapter is about. It's that, look, I could write you this long essay about, history policy, but I'm going to tell you what it feels like to be in one of the bodies that lives, and to be one of the people that endures. And I'm telling you, there's no rationale to it other than the fact that I fit the profile. I fit the box of exclusion. And so it then becomes my job to prove that I am worthy enough to be exempted from that instinct of exclusion. That's what I'm hoping people will pay attention to. And it's difficult because all the anti-vax nuts are kind of taking up all the oxygen and making it seem like the problem is the vaccine. And I was like, no. There's a qualitative difference, that a narrow issue that I think we have to pay a lot of attention to. Because once the UK does that and it becomes accepted, you can bet in 2 years, India will be doing it to other African countries. African countries will be doing it to each other. It will become the norm, that exclusion. So I feel very strongly about this. I could go on all day.
No, I mean, I can listen to it all day, and I think, can you spare 5 more? Can we talk a few more minutes? You need to, okay. Because you wrote about the things you're just talking about. You wrote about in a Washington Post piece, which just came out a couple of weeks, and so you're talking about so you're extending the book, I think, and really bringing it into this sort of the UK travel policies. And one of the things that's so powerful about that op-ed is just this logic that you're saying. Like, who could argue with the logic that vaccine passport is the way to go? I mean, on the face of it, it seems, and to be against such a thing, as you say, is culturally very challenging, because you're very easily, now people say, well, wait a minute, is he an anti-vax? What's his deal with that? And so they push you over here. And so there's a lot of nuance. You need people's attention at least for a few seconds to explain it. But as you point out, the minute the UK says, yeah, you got to have these vaccines, these approved vaccines, and every other country is out. Oh, and by the way, intellectual property of mRNA vaccines is locked up in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and we have no attention for that to reach the rest of the world. So sorry, countries that can't produce your own vaccine, we're building a system in which you can't come in. And I think the double irony there, and I think your editors at the Post didn't give you enough time with this, is that countries like South Korea and maybe even Kenya that have been resourceful in different ways in managing that have kept the death rates low, they've done that without vaccination.
Yeah,
I mean,
this
the
is
vaccine
it.
rate here has soared in South Korea in the last 2 months, but the majority of this pandemic has been done with non-vaccine methods of public health, and just
Right.
as you were describing.
Yeah, and this is the thing, is that what is seen as labor, what is seen as public health, what is seen as controlling this disease, is being determined in political processes that are not reflective of outcomes. So the UK is driving the migration and vaccine passport conversation, and you think, well, why did the pandemic get out of control in the UK? Was it because of the vaccine passports, or was there other policy questions? We talk about corruption with the track and test system. We talk about opening up too early. We talk about the delays in providing vaccinations for teenagers and things like that. There are structural issues that are bigger than just foreigners coming into the United Kingdom and making British people sick. It wasn't foreigners coming into the United Kingdom that led to all of these systemic policy failures. So to put the burden on migration policy and to have it be loaded with all of this momentum. Right now, the minister, the Home Office, Priti Patel, is pushing to end asylum in the United Kingdom, right? This is one of the things that she's been pushing this week. She wants the idea that anybody who seeks asylum is trying to game the UK system. That is part of the context. That is part of, should we say nothing, therefore, when the policy rolls out that says only these 4 vaccines produced by private commercial entities. Moderna has been around for 11 years. This is the first year that they turned a profit. And it's such an absurd profit relative to it's one of the, I don't know, I remember looking at the graph and seeing the dramatic increase in Moderna's profit.
Yeah.
Moderna didn't start giving vaccines, has not officially sold vaccines to any African countries or any poor countries, but all the Moderna that's available in poor countries is donations that have come from the United States. So there is a commercial interest that's embedded in saying there are these 4 vaccines that we are going to accept. There's a geopolitical interest that's saying we're not going to recognize the Chinese vaccines. Yeah, the Chinese vaccines are less effective, 65%. But I understand from public health, from doctors, we eradicated polio with a vaccine that was only 50% effective. So they're not perfect. What we're preventing is grave illness, hospitalization, and for that, it is good enough. So there's a geopolitical interest there that's also worth thinking about. And we are stuck in the middle.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not about, for me, it's not even about the actual act of traveling. It's not even about, we want to preserve, it's about the stigma. It's about the narrative becoming normalized, that if we manage to contain this disease in a geographical context, then we say it's a disease of those people, because that's what happened with HIV/AIDS. Once it became a poor country disease, it became almost synonymous with certain geographical areas. It's a problem in India, it's a problem in Africa. This is what we're trying to prevent. It's not going to just be about travel, it's going to be about perception. It's going to be about, it's going to have a knock-on effect on how people understand other people and stigmatize other people. The head of the Africa CDC, he said this in an interview, and I've never forgotten it, because I think he's now moving to go and head up PEPFAR. So he knows these things, and he said they will vaccinate, put in place travel restrictions, and then Africa will become the continent of COVID. That's the momentum that we're trying to stop. It has nothing to do with anti-vax or whatever. It is, we don't want to become the continent of COVID. But the sum total of denying us vaccines, stigmatizing vaccines, putting in place arbitrary hierarchies of vaccines, making it impossible for people to make vaccines, that's the anxiety that's where we're going to end up.
So just to circle back to your book, Traveling While Black, I mean, I think this is also part of the power of it is, I mean, you write about travel, but you write about the foreclosure of travel too, and the restriction of movement. And I think that, a book like this forces us to bring, and you just said it a minute ago, you got to bring into the same frame that you might be able to get on a plane and, as you describe in the book, go to Haiti, and you might be able to pull that off. Um, but that has to come with some responsibilities also.
Yeah.
And I think that that's not just Haiti. I mean, I think that's probably travel anywhere in the world. Travel to the United States, travel to Italy. You are going to see, if you're looking,
Yeah.
many of the issues that you've just been describing. And I mean, I just have to say, like, I'm a disaster researcher. So when I travel, and my family, sometimes they put up with this. But when we travel, we're going to go and we're going to go to disaster sites, and we're going to look at sites where there have been human rights
Wow.
issues, and we're going to go to war zones, and we're going to go to the DMZ and do this kind of stuff. And my kids probably travel has been
Wow, that
ruined for
sounds
them.
like fun, Dad.
Yeah, well, actually, you'd love to travel with me, and I would love to travel with you. I think for that reason, but that's a deeper sense of what travel enables.
Yeah.
But I think, again, by reading your book, it's like I think it's my hope, I guess, coming out of COVID is that you said a moment ago, some Schadenfreude, maybe we can call it a teachable moment. But people need to read works like this and realize that we have an opportunity
Yeah.
in this moment. Again, if we got people's attention just for a few extra minutes, because their travel was made more difficult because of COVID, this is a moment you got to shake them by the lapels and make them understand. Am I overstating it? I
No,
think
no,
I'm
no, no,
not.
no. I think that's absolutely right. I think that's absolutely true, and that's the thread that I was talking about. That we have to unite these factors and show people in this moment where there's a little bit less movement. There's a little bit we can have a global attention on one thing, that we can actually also say this is how this connects to other things. The stigmatization of entire communities. People aren't turning Haitians away because they've done in-depth one-to-one interviews with each Haitian person and then said, well, actually, your case is not valid. There's a wholesale deportation of Haitians that's happening because they are Haitians.
Right.
There's a wholesale deportation that's happening of people of Guatemala because they are from Guatemala. And in Kenya, wholesale deportation of Somali refugees because they're Somali. It's people building walls. There's a economist graphic about the number of all the countries that are building walls right now, border walls right now. It's become the new trend for countries to build walls as an effort of controlling mobility and stigmatizing entire populations, Zimbabweans in South Africa, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that it's not overstating it to say that we have to pay attention. So many of the evils that happen in the world happen because bad people take opportunities and good people aren't paying attention. And I think that lack of attentiveness is, but it's a malevolent thing. You have a privilege for this to not be urgent for you because you can circumvent it, so you don't pay attention to it, even though it's going to have a knock-on effect in other people. This is the kind of things that I want people to pay attention to, and that's kind of why I put it in a travel book, because I knew that people were looking for inspirational stories about how eat, pray, love, and I had passed in Italy and it changed my life, and I was like, well, no, I could. I like I said, I wrote the book in Italy. I was in Airbnb in Bologna, drinking wine and putting on weight. But like you, for me, I can't unsee. I couldn't unsee, the people who were the homeless people sitting outside the restaurants and assuming, and hearing them not speak Italian and knowing that they had come from somewhere else.
Yeah.
I couldn't unsee the inequality that was all around, and it is professionally primed to look for these things and to see these things. But I think also in writing and in looking at the pandemic, I couldn't not see, because I'd seen it in travel in other contexts. I could not see what was coming down the pipeline, and knowing and having lived through the HIV/AIDS pandemic, having lost family to HIV/AIDS, knowing how easily stigma gets created, normalized, geographically bound, not wanting people to do that again because of this malevolent laziness or apathy that can take root. So I don't think it's overstating it at all. I think it's so weird when you read history books. you can have the impression that history is always a big thing and there's, one big thing that happens. But those of us who work with history in different contexts, we know that that's just the books. It's it's like a slow burn. Crises often, it's like a slow burn, and it's just trying to stop it before the momentum becomes too great.
We're up on time, and I've been very greedy with your time, actually, but it's been a tremendous conversation. And I just would like a tiny question on the way out, which is when you're freed from this COVID trap, and I know we're talking about travel, but also the restriction of travel, but where do you want to go next?
Ooh,
What's drawing you?
Yeah, I want to go to all the places. I have to be honest, I started traveling in June. So I went to the States to get vaccinated because we didn't have any vaccines in Kenya.
Yeah.
So I have been traveling a little bit. The last place that I went to for leisure before the pandemic was Mexico City. And I had wanted to go back to Mexico because it's really a very singular place in the world. The food, the culture, the history, it's just a remarkable place. And so the dream would be, a month in Mexico, eating tacos and drinking beers and just being around such a amazing history. So that would be the dream.
And writing the follow-up to this book, I think. Yeah. Well, we're going to draw to a conclusion now. I would be remiss if I didn't give a shout out to anthropologist Adia Benton, who helped facilitate this meeting today. And she's been a guest host on COVID Calls, and she's tremendous, and I'm a huge fan of hers. So thank you, Adia, for this. And I just want to remind everybody you've been listening to COVID Calls. You can usually catch COVID Calls at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. Today was a special call at 7 p.m. Korea time, 1 p.m. Nairobi time. And the book, among her books, with the one you can check out most recently published, Traveling While Black Essays Inspired by a Life on the Move by Nanjala NyABOLA. Thanks for this time today. I really learned a lot in the conversation. Good to talk to you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Stay healthy, everybody. We'll see you next time on COVID Calls.